last panel and dealing with, in many ways, the most important questions, which is ethical, moral, normative. I don't know how many of you read Naomi Wolf's book, The Bodies of Others. Okay, so I really think, when I think about the books of our time that are going to be in 50 years, the book that everybody's going to read, I think it's that book. I wish I had published it, but it's forgiven. No, it's a remarkable book. When I read it, I thought, okay, it's the first word, the last word, we're done. This is what we need to know. And I haven't read your newest book yet. Well, at least I haven't reviewed it yet. But I'm sure it's just as mighty. How would you compare the two? Would you say?
Well, for any author, the most recent book is the best ever.
Yeah. Okay. I don't think Naomi's mic is on, actually. And then we have Aaron Kheriaty. I think we know about your mighty book, The New Abnormal, and we heard from you last night. And if you didn't come last night, you'll know next year to pay a lot of money to come on Friday night. Last night subsidizes today. And Thomas Harrington. How did I do? That's my Hispanic confused pronunciation. And then Toby Rogers, who, wow, can't say enough about Toby. So enough of that. Naomi, I want to begin with you, actually, because you have been for quite some time a bit of the moral conscience of the world in some ways. You have. And you saw early on what was wrong here, and I just, let me just say, the way you so fearlessly laid it out in that book with such passion, I don't even know what my question is. I just want to say that because, well, actually, let me ask you this. As a writer, you really do sort of, oh gosh, how do I put it? I mean, you bleed on the page. I mean, it is true in some ways. I mean, it's like you just, there it is, and the reader can feel it. And well, gosh, what is my question? I will say, let me ask you, why did so few people see things the way you saw it?
Okay, can everyone hear me now?
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey, and everyone for having this amazing event. I'm so grateful to you. Thank you to all of you, new friends, old friends. Now I will answer your question the best I can. There were a couple of reasons that I realized very quickly that we were in a kind of late-stage totalitarian, basically coup. One of them is that I'd written a book in 2008 called The End of America during the Bush era, and everyone on my side, on the left, was perfectly happy with me talking about totalitarianism in the White House at that time, not so much now. But I looked at different times and places in history where there had been the overthrowing of a fragile democracy and what had happened. So I looked at Mussolini's Italy, I looked at Nazi Germany, of course, I looked at East Germany in the 50s, I looked at China in the 80s, and all of these totalitarian regimes, whether they were on the left or on the right, it really didn't matter because the tyrants always followed a game plan. They always took the same 10 steps. There was a roadmap, 10 steps to fascism, and we actually teach this at the School for the Americas to subvert other fragile democracies ourselves and get to a totalitarian status. So step 10 is emergency law. So when in March, I think 11th, Brian, my husband, and I were, and he's a military veteran, and I've been, we've both been in conflict areas around the world, I as a journalist and he as a warrior. We heard on the radio that Broadway was closing. Not like a theater was closing or several theaters were closing, but all of Broadway was closing. And we just looked at each other and we were like, we've got to get out of the city. We moved right into this tiny house in the middle of the woods with a bear in the backyard, because we recognized from our life in conflict zones that we were no longer living in America if by fiat a whole sector could be closed. And then the other thing is in June, when then Governor Cuomo said you can only have 6 people in your home at one time, and we were then thoroughly under emergency law, which is, as I mentioned, step 10, it's the last stage. You don't get your democracy back without a fight once you're in an emergency law status. That's the suspension of the rule of law. I immediately put out a call on social media and invited 50 strangers into my home for a potluck. Health freedom activists in the local community, they looked so healthy. They'd been ignoring all the lockdowns and all the isolation, and they were radiant with glowing health. And we all crowded in and had delicious kind of hippie food. No one got sick. I took pictures and posted them on social media. You know, everyone was furious at me. But the reason I made that gesture is that I recognized that if the governor was saying in a state of emergency, you don't have your First Amendment rights anymore, the Constitution has been suspended, that we were living in a tyranny. And that was my little gesture against tyranny. But those were the early signs that led me to realize quickly what was happening.
Yeah, and it was dark times for you, right? I mean, it was terrible, emotionally terrible times. I mean, for me anyway, it was like the lights went out.
Yeah, I think you and I processed that very differently. There was another clue for me, which is I'm an English major. I'm not a medical doctor or a scientist. I have a DPhil in Victorian poetry. And well, as a result of having been a graduate student in English literature, I've read the memoirs and novels of the last 400 years in English, most of them. And we've had epidemics before, far, far worse than this. We've had typhus and cholera and, yellow fever and smallpox, and never, ever, ever, ever were people advised to crowd multi-generational households, crowded into a dark room, forbidden light and sun and fresh air and exercise. And we knew since the Crimean War that was a bad idea. So I knew that they were lying to me because I've read the Brontes. You know?
Yeah, and also, so there's that, but also you had probably a greater sense of the possibility of emergency regulation because you'd already written your 2008 book.
Yes, and the last reason I think you and I processed this differently, I was less shocked, I think, than you were.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Like we saw each other, I was a fellow at your institute at that time,
right.
And you were shocked that Western civilization could collapse all at once.
I was.
And I wasn't at all shocked, not just because of my study of tyrannies, but because of my lineage, because I descend from a woman who lost 9 brothers and sisters in the Holocaust.
Okay.
And my children's grandfather, we went to visit their apartment in Berlin where, they had to flee after years and years and decades of perfect civilization. Yeah. So it wasn't surprising to me that this could happen. Yeah. What was painful was seeing the madness unfold among my own liberal tribe of people who believed themselves to be, and whom I had believed to be, rational, educated, critical thinkers, tolerant, inclusive, egalitarian, and the embrace of a two-tier society overnight without a resistance of any kind. That was what was shocking to me.
Yeah, and then followed up with the segregation, which was beyond uncommented upon segregation of major urban centers and so on, to the point you couldn't even get into New York without having taken the shot.
Right.
Yeah. And now, the lesson I'm learning from Naomi here is to read your history and take it seriously, which I think I had failed to do in some ways, because I thought the history was always in the past, and we were better than that. What about you?
I think there's nothing new under the sun. And one of the reasons that we're in this fix is that we've forgotten our history, including even recent history. You don't need to go much further back than the history of the 20th century, but you can go back to the plague of Justinian in ancient Rome, where they didn't understand the mechanisms of immunity and natural immunity, but they understood that there was a thing that we now call natural immunity, because they would have those who got sick during that plague, which was probably smallpox, most historians believe, and they would have those folks care for the symptomatic ill, because they knew, first of all, they're a buffer of transmission. They're much less likely to transmit that virus to others, and they're also not going to get sick again, so you're not putting the caregivers at undue risk of contracting the disease. So this knowledge is nearly 2,000 years old, and we abandoned it because we had forgotten our history. But I mean, for me, we have to understand the history of the 19th and 20th century. This is on ethics, so I'll say just a little bit about how we abandoned a traditional Hippocratic understanding of the physician and of medicine. So I have a section in the New Abnormal entitled Hippocratic versus Technocratic Medicine. And the basic lesson can be drawn from Germany in the 1920s and 1930s. Prior to the Nazis coming to power, a novel idea had taken hold in German medicine, which at the time was the most prestigious in the world. The German medical schools, German medical institutions were top flight. It wasn't Harvard and places in the United States or other Western countries. It was Germany. But an idea was introduced, in part seeded by the eugenics movement here in the United States, that said, no, the physician's job is not primarily to attend to the sick individual in front of them, which was the traditional Hippocratic ethic. I have a fiduciary duty to the patient who happens to be under my care, because illness has made that patient vulnerable. There's a power differential between me and the patient. We're equal in dignity and we're equal in rights, but there's an inequality of power when one person is sick, seeking the care of another person who has a monopoly. Society's given us a monopoly on knowledge and access to testing and the ability to do something like a surgery. And the patient, for that relationship to work, has to place their trust in the physician, who may be a person that they just met when they showed up to the ER and encountered this doctor for the first time. And so traditional medical ethics has always said that the physician has a duty always to put their knowledge and skills only at the service of healing that individual. And we make a public profession. That's where the word profession comes from. In the ancient world, there were, we call most occupations these days professions, but the original meaning of the term applied to only 4 occupations, all of which involved a relationship like this. And these 4 professions, medicine, law, teaching, and the priesthood, would take a public oath, promising to use their knowledge and skills only for the good of their client or their student or their patient or the penitent who came to them for spiritual care. And for us, it was the Hippocratic Oath. That was abandoned in Germany in the 1920s when a new concept came along that said doctors' primary responsibility is not to the individual patient, but to the social organism. There was this metaphor that society, or the Volk, in the German people as a whole, can be healthy or sick. And medicine needs to basically adopt an ethos whereby we make society as a whole healthier. Well, on this metaphor, individuals can be characterized as a cancer on the body politic. What do you do with the cancer if you're a physician? Well, you carve it out and discard it to save the health of the whole. So we shifted from an individual ethic of care for the person who has intrinsic dignity and who's vulnerable because of illness to agents basically of a social program. 45% of physicians in Germany joined the Nazi Party, even though it wasn't compulsory. Compare that to 10% of teachers in Germany that voluntarily joined the Nazi Party. This ethos had taken hold even before Hitler came to power and made it possible for the Germans to accelerate first the T4 euthanasia. Well, first the involuntary sterilization program, which we had here in the United States. They imported that from us. And then the euthanasia program. And the first individuals who were gassed under the Nazis were not Jews or other ethnic minorities in concentration camps, the first individuals gassed were psychiatric patients in psychiatric hospitals, and those deaths were signed off by physicians, by psychiatrists, which is my own profession. And then that was expanded, obviously, during the quote-unquote final solution to exterminate people in unspeakably horrifying numbers. But the medical profession went along with that program because they shifted, and it can look like a subtle shift initially, very subtle. But the reason I'm mentioning this is I'm starting to hear buzz here and there with medical societies, with state medical boards, the rhetoric that's being deployed by organized medicine is along the lines of, well, your primary responsibility is not to your patient, but to public health as a whole, or the health of the, and it's an echo of something that I had studied and used to teach back when I had a job in medical school. And it's very worrisome because it can be insidious. Like, who doesn't want, it's framed in the language of the public good or the common good, but really it's underneath that is very crass utilitarian ethic that is willing to discard people. And it's always going to be first the people on the margins, the disabled and the vulnerable, and then expanding to other undesirables or political dissidents or, what have you. So it's very important for us to maintain that traditional Hippocratic ethic.
It's a fascinating thing, the way you draw a parallel between the growing fashion for technology as it developed, after the turn of the millennium, and then how it bled over into public health. We began to just celebrate the computers and the digital age, and the science and computer programmers will solve everything, and then.
Well, I mean, since we're on the topic of the Nazis, this was the development of technological machinery, where the people actually ordering the mass killings were bureaucrats doing this from a distance, looking at charts and graphs, and just sort of, engineers sitting at the soundboard and, dialing this thing up and dialing that thing down and making sure the trains run on time. And one of the kind of mind-boggling things to come out of Nuremberg, of course, was just how banal all of this had become, and basically the embrace of mass technology as a way to re-engineer on a mass scale society to attempt to solve social problems. Well, basically abstracted from tangible, real people to the point where apparently sane people, I mean, some of them were sociopaths, but, lots of ordinary people, it's rather uncomfortable to think about it, participated in what happened in Germany. And I think that a sort of fetish with mass technology and mass society was one of the things that facilitated that.
I think about my own love of technology that developed after 1995. I was one of those people who thought that flying cars were on their way, and the last thing I expected that we wouldn't get to flying cars, but we would get lockdowns, So I see Tom Harrington over here nodding his head. I would like you to weigh in on this.
Was I ready for it? Sadly, I was. I'd been waiting for it for 20 years. September 11th to me, and even the Panama invasion and the fomented hysteria about them had put me on a search, and I've been very lucky to have spent 30 years studying a country and its many cultures, Spain, that has a lot to tell us about many of the same things you've been talking about, Aaron. Spanish fascism, the Spanish Civil War, the failure of the Spanish Republic, the fact that I've spent 30 years being in Spain and talking to people who actually lived through it and had to tell you about the person in the same village that was ready to kill them, and how those things were never dealt with. There's another part to it, however, that my particular interest within Spain was what I'll call the management of memory, or the creation and management of memory. And what do I mean by that? My particular interest was looking at the nationalities movements that have ebbed and flowed within Spain over the last 500 years in greater or lesser measure. And there's a couple of ways you can look at how nations take place or occur, is that they are just spontaneous occurrences. But there's another approach that looks at them as constructed entities, in which elites play an oversized role in producing the cultural materials that are then sold to the populace to create the sense of national identity. And I had an aha moment or two in the archives looking, finding out that 2 or 3 people created many of the tropes of one of the nationality movements in Spain in the 1920s. You go, wow, elites. Elites working with memory, elites going back into memory, instrumentalizing pieces of memory, and then deploying them as normative through the power of their relationship with powerful actors, be it the press, be it economic entities. So the idea is to create the mythos, mining the past, and then sell that mythos based on the selective mining of the past to the populace who says, oh, I guess that's what I am. And so it's a whole different way of looking at the way ideas come. If you can manufacture as something as seemingly tectonic as the nation, what else can't you manufacture in this marriage between elites and myth makers? And so once I began to apply that to the world of politics some 25 years ago, I began to do something different. Instead of listening to what the news was saying, I would begin mapping the connections between myth makers and power centers, and creating maps of who was who within these places. And once you begin to look at power and what is real and what is told to you as is given you as a reality in social terms, you begin to look at the world in a very different way. And September 11th, in that sense, was a very, by that time I was well immersed in this way of thinking, and I said, oh, well, who are the power centers? What are the desires? And who are creating the myths? And with what frequency and from where are those myths being constantly hammered at us? And so when this came along, I said, oh, we've seen this before. There's a mythologization of so many things. And so they're managing memory for us. They're creating new memories for us. They're creating new rituals for us, which is one of the things that nationalist activists always do. There's always a religious impulse underlying the creation of nations. And so all that really modern nationalism did was to take the religious impulse, create new rituals, and channel it toward a secular seeming project. And if you begin to internalize that as, shall we say, structurally universal, or at least in some sense, that there's a human desire for transcendence that needs to be met through religious practice, social practice, or another practice that substitutes something transcendent, then you begin to understand these things. And what we saw clearly during the COVID time was all sorts of initiation rituals, religious rituals, pertinence rituals, are you with us or against us, sectarian rituals. And this was fairly evident to me because of what I had seen studying a sectarian country, and then within that sectarianism, the rise, fall, and creation and spreading of nationalist projects.
And sacraments, too.
Sacraments. Well, Spanish nationalism is different from, the Spanish fascism was different in that it merged Italian German fascism had an arm's length relationship with the church.
Yeah.
Spanish, owing to the history of the country, had a very tight relationship. Yeah. And so all of the sacramentality and the language of sacramentality was immediately merged into the Franco regime.
Yeah. Or in the case of COVID, into the jab.
Or the hand sanitizer, the holy water.
The holy water, sure.
That was the sacrament. Sure. Right. Toby, you of all people have been prepared. You've been preparing for it your entire academic life because you had been observing something that very few people had seen, which was widespread abuse of pharmacological power and the population injury thereof. So, how quickly after the lockdowns did you anticipate where this would end up?
Yeah, so I had the benefit of working on corruption in the pharmaceutical industry for 5 years before COVID.
Yeah.
I was doing a PhD in Sydney, Australia, and I worked on the political economy of autism. And what I discovered is that autism is not a scientific question anymore. We know what's causing autism. Rather, autism is a problem of regulatory capture. FDA is captured, CDC is captured, NIH is captured, Congress is captured. That's why the autism epidemic happened. That's why government isn't doing anything about it. So, and I had already been fighting in the vaccine wars in the United States in 2019 when I graduated. And so I saw what pharma was up to, running vaccine mandate bills in nearly every state.
Yeah.
So when COVID hit in 2020, I was working at Children's Health Defense. And they knew right away what was going on. Lynn Redwood, who was executive director at the time, formerly worked for DOD, and she knew that DOD had been working on gain-of-function viruses since 2005 in connection with bat coronaviruses. CHD knew from day one that this was a gain-of-function virus, that it escaped, and they knew exactly what was going on. So Robert Kennedy knew, the entire CHD team knew, and so we wrote some of the first articles on gain-of-function. I wrote one of the first articles on Wuhan gain-of-function to knock down the Anderson paper, the Fauci paper that was out there trying to argue, that it had come from pangolins or whatever. And then I wrote one of the first papers on deaths of despair and on the inflation that was going to happen from printing money. We could see all this in March and April of 2020. It wasn't really a surprise. What was a surprise was the complete collapse of our entire system, universities, media, government, doctors, scientists. I mean, it's a complete collapse of the system. That was a shock. We're still in trauma today, right? Yeah. We're still dealing with that shock.
I remember, Naomi, one time you introduced you were speaking at a conference I was at, and you got up and made a shocking statement. You said, all of our institutions have collapsed. And I thought, well, that's quite a statement. And everybody nodded their head. Maybe you want to elaborate on what Toby just said, particularly as it pertains to pharma, since you've done so much work in that area.
Oh, thank you. Gosh. Well, I think it's really helpful. Like, one of the themes of The Bodies of Others, the book that Jeffrey mentioned in introducing me, is that one of the goals of the lockdowns was to keep us isolated because in human connection, there's the power to resist innate tyranny. But that means direct human connection. And, they can censor social media all they want as long as we're in a room talking to each other face to face. And actually, I make the case, I'm the CEO of a tech company, so I know how profitable it was to drive everyone onto social media platforms or, e-commerce platforms or distance learning platforms. And I know how manipulable everything is on the back end, right? You have no privacy on the back end. I can do anything to your algorithm. There's just no safety in technology, I say, as a tech company CEO. My company's perfect, of course, but where I'm going with that is when I wouldn't have known, like I'm in touch with Toby digitally, but it's not till I heard him and was able to converse with him face to face that I understood that he understood a piece of the puzzle dating back, 5 years and related to a whole other part of the spectrum of pharma darkness, right? And so his knowledge face to face assists and reinforces and complexifies my knowledge, which is based on this team of 3,250 doctors and scientists and nurses and RNs and biostatisticians and medical fraud investigators who have united under the War Room Daily Cloud banner. Daily Cloud is my company, to go through the Pfizer documents that were released under court order. So I guess what I'm just saying is the themes that I've heard today are that, it's up to us to protect civilization. And what I'm hearing from Toby and the other speakers is that civilization depends on the individual and the community in relationship. And I guess I just want to reiterate from seeing the power of the technology of human beings in community face-to-face speaking or singing or worshiping or gathering in a town hall. That is, the human brain, the human community, the human living room full of activists eating, hippie food. That technology is very hard to hack, right? It's a very secure technology. It's hard to mess with the algorithm of people being persuaded face-to-face. There is no algorithm, right? It's hard to surveil people who go into a room and close the door, right, and speak to one another. So that's a big reason that the messaging, the many kinds of propaganda that we've heard about, so much of it is about the untrustworthiness of other people, of intimacy, the treacheries in public space, the need to be kind of isolated and fragmented and the destruction of community. But I would flip that around more hopefully, because I think at this point we need hope, or else we're just going to leave here and take a Valium. But what they're so afraid of is exactly this, right? What they're so afraid of is these minds in these physical bodies, gathering together and saying, you know what, no, you're not going to take away my First Amendment rights. No, you're not going to inject me with something and violate my medical autonomy. No, you're not going to tell my child that lies. You're not going to dissolve my nation without my consent, which is happening. It's my belief that we're actually at war right now, that war is being waged on us. It's being waged on us in multiple ways, multivalent warfare. It's what China watchers call unrestricted warfare, the open border, the seizure of our pharmaceutical flow, which actually my reporting revealed comes from China. China has the IP for the BioNTech injection, which is Pfizer's COVID injection. China manufactured 14 plants in Western Europe. China manufactured 1 billion doses for export, not for internal use. China opened 2 manufacturing plants in the United States. So now when you get a Pfizer injection, it's China, right, which is not our friend. So, the food supply is under attack. The grid is under attack. There's weird disruptions of the delivery of all of the things we used to take for granted. We're at war. Our border is open. I'm the daughter and granddaughter of immigrants. I believe in legal immigration. Our border is open in a way that is unsustainable for a democracy, because a democracy requires citizens, and citizenship requires people being citizens. And so all of that is happening intentionally because the idea of the West is an idea that is the tyrants cannot conquer. It'll always overwhelm tyrants eventually. So the tactic clearly is to do away with Western Europe and to do away with America as the country we've always understood it to be.
You know, you just reminded me, you know where our masks came from, right?
China.
Yeah.
And the tests came from China.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole PPE thing was a gigantic check.
It was.
The Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah.
I'm not kidding.
Yeah, you can see the trade figures just go. Imports were collapsing after the tariffs, and then after the lockdowns, they just soared from China, of all places. Yeah.
Well, what's happening in the Western countries is a new form of totalitarianism. So this word has been used several times today, including by me, and people may wonder why I don't see the apparatus of totalitarian systems here yet. There's no barbed wire, there's no secret police, there's no mass surveillance. By the way, there is mass surveillance, but just the new form of totalitarian control that we're experiencing today is not going to repeat exactly what we saw with Nazism or communism or Italian fascism, but it's going to use many of the same tools. And one of those tools is these are systems of disintegration before they're systems of domination. So you pointed out the sort of flattening of civil society. What a totalitarian system wants is nothing between the individual and the state. And those mediating institutions of civil society that de Tocqueville was so impressed with when he came to America, this was the real strength of what we had here. The voluntary associations, the schools, the churches, the gathering spaces, the book clubs, the people face-to-face together, organizing their lives, supporting one another, helping one another, learning from one another. If you think about what happened in March of 2020,
that
was all shut down.
That had never occurred to me. That is a direct attack on all.
It was an attack on schools, churches.
Yeah,
you can't gather together with more than 6 people. I mean, there were 7 people in my family. I have 5 kids. So it's, they're disintegrating my family. I'm already breaking the law by being under my own roof.
Go ahead, Tom.
It's even worse than what you described.
I can always count on you.
This is the hopeful part.
It's even worse than you described.
I think it's worse than what I described.
No.
Too. I was just getting warmed up. I didn't want
I'll zero in on what I'm talking about. You are right about the institutions being taken apart and the mediating institutions. But what's even worse is we're getting new mediations which are controlled by forces that we don't understand.
Right.
So there's the destruction of the mediating institutions which are necessary for the maintenance of historical memory and ethics. You can't have ethics without historical memory. So if you do away with those institutions and you substitute them for other mediating institutions which may or may not have a foreign debt in moral terms, or may be controlled by a cabal in Washington. So you're really substituting one mediation, which is a civic one, with a mediation which has nefarious actors who are invisible to us.
Technocratic.
And not answerable to us.
Not answerable to us.
So, national organization.
You know, I don't have Ryan Cole's ability to make aphorisms, but I love aphorisms. And this gets to something that I think has been one of the subjects that has been sub rosa here during the day. One of my favorite aphorisms is from Václav Havel when he spoke to the U.S. Congress, and he said, "Consciousness precedes being."
Yeah.
And the question we've had here is how much of this is because we have evil elites, or how much of this is because we've lost consciousness as a people? I think we have to work from the premise that it's because we've lost consciousness of these things through the destruction of our mediating institutions. And then it raises the difficult questions of how do you recover these things.
Tom, sorry.
No,
Toby, you go ahead.
And this is where I guess, and you could call it a cop-out, but this is where I go back to simple things. Eating around a table with friends. There's a reason that it lies at the center of the Christian liturgy. and probably every other religious liturgy in the world. There's a reason for that, because that's the place where we become nude and in confidence with others in a spiritual sense. And we become, the word for conspire is do you breathe together. We are breathing together. And simple things like making sure, as you've talked about, Naomi, that we dine together, that we drink together, that we argue together, that we don't allow these other mediations to become between us and the idea of healthy argumentation and discourse.
Yeah.
This whole idea that when people get in the least conflict in our culture, we go, well, change the subject. Let's just change the subject.
Right.
To me, that's the result of a failure of socialization, which has come out of the failure of the table. And I'll use the table as a metaphor in that sense.
Toby, please go ahead. No, please.
Toby, you, and then Naomi, we're going to call it.
All right. So I love the notion of consciousness precedes being. It's the perfect segue. And the people in this room, thanks to the leadership of Jeffrey Tucker, are more conscious about what's happening than the general public. So if I may, I'd like to look forward for to the year ahead and the work ahead of us. I think that ideas matter. We are trying to win the battle of ideas, but we have our work cut out for us as far as what we need to figure out in the next year, 5 years, 10 years, in order to win this battle. Yeah. So I've sketched it out briefly. Let me just run through it real quick. And the reason I'm focused on this year is we are 12 months out from a presidential election. But if Robert Kennedy or Ron DeSantis are elected and we haven't done the thought work for what governing and taking power looks like, it's not going to work. They're not going to be able to do any reforming if we haven't done the thought work first, and we have not done the thought work. So my bottom line is all of the problems that we've talked about today and that we write about at the Brownstone Institute, they only end when we take power. That's the shift in our mindset. We keep asking for reform from people who are incapable of reform at this point. All of the problems that we're talking about only end when we take power. But in order to take power, we have to do the thought work about what it's going to be like to actually run this place. We have to think of ourselves as a government in waiting, but we have to do the work to build that.
Terrifying to me. I'm not sure.
So Toby for Senate, right?
or Jeffrey for president, and everybody on this stand for president as well, or for elected office. So, if I may, we have to define what freedom looks like in 2023. In the past, it would have been low taxes, free trade, support for the Second Amendment, and none of those things protected us in this past year. We have 93 million guns in this country. They did nothing for us when fascism was imposed upon us. People drove themselves to the appointments that would kill them because their TV said that that's what they should do. So we have to define what a freedom agenda actually looks like. Then we have to have a conversation about what do we have to do so this never happens again? Do we have to add a constitutional amendment? What do we have to do to constrain the federal government? How do we stop regulatory capture? We all talk about regulatory capture. How do you stop it? We have to have that conversation. What do we do about the intelligence agencies? And if we don't figure this out, nobody else will. We need to have an actual political program. And I think it's great that RFK Jr. and Ron DeSantis are running for president, but we got to run for school board, board of supervisors, state level, federal level. We have to have an actual political program and not hope that somebody's tweets are going to get somebody elected. Like, we have to build actual political power. But in order to do that, we have to actually have a platform. What are the things we agree on? What are the things we disagree on? What's essential? And what are we going to, allow to be part of a big tent? Will we have a truth commission? Will we have a Nuremberg 2? Who's going to be on it? And how will we make sure that it doesn't become... There we go. Absolutely. how do we make sure that it doesn't become a cover-up commission, which is what's starting to happen with some of these groups? And look, these are capital crimes. These are crimes against humanity that we're talking about here. Are we prepared to prosecute capital crimes? There's a mental shift that has to happen in order for this to occur. What's to be done about the FDA, CDC, NIH? We're all frustrated with them. Are we going to eliminate them? What replaces them, and what does that look like? We have to have that conversation. We have to figure out all of that in order to take power. What's to be done about the intelligence agencies? CIA, NSA seem to be running the place. What do we do about them? What do we do about corporate power? For the first time in history, there are a dozen corporations that are worth $1 trillion. That's never, the founders couldn't have imagined that. What do we do about corporate power? And then finally, what do we do about the philanthropic sector? Philanthropies have become predatory. They're an active force for evil in the world at this point. What do we do about those folks? So my point here is that winning elections becomes so much easier when we do the thought work first, when we lay out what the government will look like when we take power. And look, I know in the movement there's sort of this nihilistic tendency that says, oh, elections, can we trust elections? Well, the civil rights movement dealt with rigged elections, right? This is not a new problem. We can look to the civil rights movement to figure out how you deal with a government that doesn't want to count votes in a particular election. And as far as the intelligence agencies, I think, again, there's a sense of, oh my goodness, they're so powerful, what on earth can we do? Well, look, the people of Eastern Europe have dealt with this problem before. They've dealt with the totalitarian system before. There are ways to overthrow totalitarian systems. We need to learn from the lessons of Eastern Europe and figure out how to take power ourselves. But in general, I think we need to shift our mindset to taking power, but taking power gets a whole lot easier if we do the thought work first, and the Brownstone Institute is the place to make that happen.
Thank you, Toby, Thomas, Aaron, Naomi. Let's thank all of our brilliant panelists here and all day today.